All right. Happy New Year, everybody, and welcome to the channel. We've already got people on. Hey, Bo, welcome back. It is such an honor to be here again today. We are going through 6 panels today from different indie fantasy authors, and in this case, science fiction and fantasy authors for this specific panel. Uh, this has just been such an honor. We've got 4 brand new faces, all in that sci-fi science fantasy genre. We'll talk a little bit about what the difference is after we make our introductions. But Danielle, why don't you kick us off? Just let us know a little bit about yourself, what you write, and then we'll just go clockwise around.
Sure. My name's Danielle Novotny. I write kind of a young adult science fiction blend. I'm wrapping up my very first trilogy. So right now I have my first 2 books published, Remade and Renown, and then Reclaimed is coming out this year, which I'm very excited for, and also nervous to wrap up my first ever series. But I've always been huge into reading, love reading any type of genre, and it's such an honor to be, here today, Katherine, and celebrating with everyone else too. This is an awesome panel.
I'm really excited to hear about the last book because you were here on the Blitz last year. And one of the things that's been amazing is seeing how far we come in a single year and going back and saying, here's what we were doing last year. This year, you're getting ready to finish the whole series out. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Jim, you're one of our newer writer acquaintances through a friend. It is such a pleasure to meet you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you write?
Yeah, I'm Jim Wilborn. I write epic fantasy, I would say mostly. Right now I'm writing a series called The Continual Chronicles, and it's kind of an epic fantasy with a magic system that kind of plays with science in a way. So that's a lot of fun. I have the first book, The 7th Cadence, is out. It's been out for over a year, and it has a follow-up novella, book 1.5 that came out a couple months ago. And yeah, I'm looking forward to continue writing that. So good to see you guys today.
Yes, so good to meet you and talk a little bit about your special magic system, because I think one of the things that a lot of science fantasy brings together is the magic science systems that maybe epic fantasy by itself doesn't always have. Tyreen, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you write? I feel like I've known you so long. It's just so surreal putting your face to your name.
That's cool. Thanks. It's great to meet you in person. And I write kind of a mix of science fiction and fantasy, and I write some poetry and other things too. But I started out with a fantasy trilogy, and well, actually, I should say I started out with a science fiction book that is yet to be published because it just feels like a mess. I wrote it when I was like, I don't know, 25, and I wasn't ready to write that scope at that point. But yeah, I have written fantasy, and my newer novella series is kind of what I call science fantasy because it's the Earth Girl goes, to space, and the great galaxy is populated by dryads and dragons and elves, but they don't necessarily call themselves that, but that's kind of what they're based on. So yeah, so that's kind of how I feel like I fit this panel, that science fantasy side. So yeah, it's awesome. Great to be here.
And I saw your comment yesterday about Noble Bright too. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that once we get into the genre conversation in a second. SG, welcome back. You came earlier this year and chatted. You are a multi-award winning author. It is such an honor to have you with us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the kind of books you write for the people who don't already know you?
Well, thank you, Katherine. I'm so happy to be back. As you said, I'm SG Blaze, and I'm the author of the Leslemanian saga, with 3 books out that follows a 19-year-old sassy princess who must defeat the Dark God and find her true place in the 7 galaxies in the meantime. And I'm just happy to tell you that I just finished the 4th book yesterday. So wrapped up 2022 with that. It's only version 1, but very excited for this new year and can't wait to see what it brings.
Very exciting. Very excited. And I saw that you won another award this past year, I think, too.
Thank you. It was a very big surprise. I think it was the San Francisco Book Festival or the New England Book Festival, one of these book festivals. And it was such a big surprise because we entered the third book right at the deadline. So we're very happy to see that was the first competition result that came through. And it's such an honor that the books get the recognition. And I still can't believe it.
I love the dreams. If you're watching and you'd like to know more about SG's story getting to here, because this panel is going to be for what's coming in the new year, you can definitely go check out my indie author interview playlist and her stories there. And it's very inspirational, talking about writing in English, talking about just overcoming everything you did to become an author. And really, I feel like I'm the baby author in this group. Danielle was already published. Tyrene was already publishing before I ever joined this scene. So it's such an honor to learn from all of you. So talking a little bit about genres here, sci-fi, science fantasy, what is the difference to you between those two? Because there seems to be a good bit of confusion and people who are very protective, like I only want to be fantasy or I only want to be sci-fi, and then the science fantasy sort of marries those two worlds. Personally, it's one of my favorite genres, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'll just jump in if that's okay.
Yeah.
I guess I kind of feel like, so one of the first movies I saw as a kid was Star Wars, and I kind of feel like that's actually kind of science fantasy, because you have this force, and even though it gets explained in the series later as being science, it always kind of felt like fantasy in space to me, or like kind of one of the fairy tales I was already familiar with, but then set in this, big background of outer space and different places. And I am so sorry. Anyway, I just think it's that combination of whether you have space travel and some kind of system or a power that isn't easily explained by science, or I don't know, elves in space, or you have a magic system like Jim's that's got a science element to it.
Yeah. To me, sci-fi represents technology and how does a society deals with this technology. Is there advantages, disadvantages, what's happening? And in my book series, The Last Luminian, I actually marry technology with magic. And so that brings a whole different element for the society to deal with, and all the characters who have to, counter the issues that this technology raises. But I also mix sci-fi and fantasy in my book series so for me, it's not separate.
Mm. Yes. Jim, I'd love to hear about, your magic system and how it incorporates science, and how, you define when you've gone enough into science to be officially science fantasy, in your opinion.
Yeah, I would say that for me, probably contrary to a lot of science fantasy writers, is that mine is way more fantasy than science fiction. It's really just how I use the magic and how I use my plot lines that make it, for me, science fantasy. I'm very much inspired by shows like Star Trek and various science fiction shows, television shows, mainly because science fiction television shows, for some reason, seem to be able to pull off a story better than fantasy. I'm not sure why, but that's just the reality of it. But because of that, watching so many of those, I thought, oh, it's so cool when there's like a scientific solution to a problem, and they're working through like, oh, what if we reverse the polarity or something way cooler than that? But trying to make that feeling in a fantasy story was really cool to me, and I want to do that and want to see how far I could make a magic system fit into the science fiction realm. But the difference between science fiction and fantasy for me is I don't think they're that different. I kind of feel like they're the same genre. It just looks different. It's all magic to me. So they just so naturally blend. Personally, I just think of science fiction as a subgenre of fantasy, and it's just a super well-defined one with a lot of established writers and filmmakers and whatnot. So to me, it's the same genre. It's just, you know, how you want to express, you know, the magical things that can happen in the world. So.
And how about you, Danielle? What are your thoughts?
I haven't dabbled in fantasy yet, so I'm still on the sci-fi side. But I've always taken it as science fiction books have that technological basis that you can explain technically how a rocket shoots off or a ship might take off and go into space. But there's that futuristic twist to it that the characters don't quite know because our technology hasn't reached that point where it's, you know, reality for us yet. Which add another layer to that is the science fiction or space opera, where science fiction deals more with the technology and futuristic elements, and then space opera stories tend to have more personal connections in a sci-fi world.
Yes, I love space operas. If you followed my book reviews, you know I've got a big weak spot for space operas, which of course I think started with A New Hope when I was a little girl growing up, is getting into that and seeing the relationships and the characters within that sci-fi setting that before, you know, Star Trek hits on very well. I like it too. So I'm not one of those people that's like, I'm a Trekkie or I'm a Star Wars fan. But, you know, I think Star Trek focused more on the plot overall, the big world building of this entire universe. And Star Wars has a big universe available, but it zooms in and it stays very focused on characters. And I've heard so many different examples of science fantasy and science fiction over the years, but there's always just a few key differences that stand out to me as a reader, since I don't write science fantasy and I don't write sci-fi. I just love to read it. There's the hard sci-fi, you know, where every detail. I read one story where there was a time machine and he went to so much detail to describe how this time machine was built and worked that I was like, I feel like I should be able to go build a time machine based on this book. And now I'm told that that's like a hard sci-fi. And then that ranges all the way down. And like Jim said, to a point where there's no distinguishable difference from a fantasy. We've gone all the way into fantasy. So there's just a broad spectrum for lovers of science and magic, and people who don't love magic would love the time traveling book where they can learn how to make a time machine. So it's just great. But that makes me wonder, for you, do you feel obligated to explain the science very technically in your books, or are you okay letting the reader just sort of imagine how that works? And Danielle, since you're straight up sci-fi, I'll start with you on this, but how much research do you feel like you have to do and understand to be able to write the science part?
Because my story is really the girl taken from Earth and kind of thrust into the galaxy where there's so many things beyond her comprehension, I've left a bunch of it to, you know, people explain it to her, but she kind of goes blank because she doesn't really understand what they've explained, or she accepts that things are out of her grasp in a way because she hasn't been, you know, raised that way, and the galaxy is so technologically advanced compared to Earth. So I've broken down a couple things, maybe the futuristic weapons and some spaceships, but for the most part, I kind of leave it to the reader to understand that this is how things are in the world of my stories. And it might not make the most sense to the character, but overall, it's a very cohesive, you know, this is how it is.
How about you, Jim? Because yours is married to your magic system. Did you have to do a lot of research into the science aspect?
For the plot, how I construct my plots, yes, in a way, but it's not a whole lot of research for me. The tricky thing with either magic systems or explaining technology is how much should you explain before it becomes boring. Usually I try not to explain as much as possible while still making it feel real. And to me, I just pick something or a couple different things that I can explain And then it kind of just serves as a nifty trick to make the reader think that I know everything. And really, I just kind of take a couple things to explain. But yeah, for the actual plots, since I try to create like a science, like something that actually you could have done, provided you had, enough energy, enough time, space, whatever, to do that thing with science. It can get a little creative in trying to figure out a scientific solution to a big problem. So doing that research is probably the hardest part. Once I figure out, what scientific principle I want to explore.
Tyrene, how has it played a role in your writing? Because I know you said that you were starting in sci-fi and now you're doing science fantasy. Is that technological aspect part of what shifted that for you?
I think it did. I think that is definitely part of it. That first novel that maybe someday I'll finish, it had a bunch of genetic DNA stuff in there. And I thought, I felt like I had gotten over my head in the science stuff when I was researching. And in the science fantasy novella series, I have to admit, I researched ways of, space travel. And then I thought, you know what, almost all of the stories, Star Trek, all of the stories, it's almost pretty well a really long-winded explanation of magic. We don't really know how it happens, and they do use scientific terms and ideas, but I just went with, and it works. and they have faster than light. They skip from one place to another, and then in the first book and in the second book a little bit, there's some stuff about photomedicine, and I don't explain it, but it's like photonic medicine. It's light-based medicine. And again, I wish I had a great explanation for that. I wish I could, have that work. But I just kind of made the short explanation and hoped that it was still a fun story to read and didn't make anybody shake their head and go, oh, this is, it's supposed to be fun to read. That's the point at the moment.
Yes. And SG, how about you? So Last Luminian's very much science and fantasy married together. Do you feel like you had to do a lot of research or anything into the science side?
Absolutely. In fact, I start with researching what knowledge is available about space travel, and try to take my understanding and put it in the books, and then have my characters discover how things work. So there is some explanation, but they also interact with the, technology that's infused with magic, or in another world, technology that's infused with biological components, or another society where it's full on magic. Everything is magic. So I like to create a world where the readers can immerse themselves and explore these components, and not to overwhelm them with too much explanation, and let their imagination fill in the gaps that I wouldn't know how to fill in, because these things don't really exist. They're just made up.
Yes. We've got a question. If you're watching live and you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll pull them up on the screen as we go through today. And if you're watching the replay, you can leave questions in the comments and I will make sure they get to the authors after the live. But Luna asks, what drew you to this genre of writing? Now, Danielle, I know you probably remember that question, a similar question from last year. So what drew you to this genre of writing?
Well, for starters, I actually didn't read a lot of science fiction before I started writing the series. My first attempt at writing was a fictional vampire-based novel that I just could not put a plot together for. And one night I had this really vivid dream about a girl fighting aliens, and it felt very futuristic. And I knew that the only setting that it would make sense to proceed in was a bit of a science fiction space opera genre.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Tyrene? What drew you into science fiction, science fantasy?
Well, I think partly because I'd read quite a bit. I'd read quite a bit of sci-fi, and I really enjoyed it. I liked this idea of people solving things, and I felt like that was something that really drew me to the genre. But then, like with science fantasy, and the novella series started with going to the movie theater one day and they had those seats that do the like movement thing.
Mhm.
And I thought, what if the whole movie theater was a spaceship? And for some reason, that's the story just went from there in my head. I was like, oh, so this girl gets trapped on this movie theater that turns into a spaceship. And then anyway, it just, it's kind of a what if extrapolation. But yeah, I just think it's a fun genre to play around in, to ask what if questions and try to get characters to figure things out. And like SG said, kind of get new experiences as they go and learn things as they go.
Mm-hmm. SG, I know you went into this pretty deep in our one-to-one interview, but briefer for the newer people, what drew you into science fantasy?
It's definitely the rich world building and the space travel aspect that allows me to discover every corner of these 7 galaxies and meet different worlds, different societies, and throw my characters in the midst of it and see what they do. Are they going to swim or are they going to sink? And I just love that aspect of any sci-fi fantasy stories, that it just grabs you and inspires you even after you put the book down or you're done watching that movie.
Mm-hmm. And Jim, what drew you? Because I know you said you had a lot of epic fantasy inspirations. What drew you into that science fantasy?
Yeah, I read a whole lot of epic fantasy as a teenager, and of course, I watched a whole lot of science fiction shows as a teenager and adult. So those two things felt like two paths that I wanted to take, and I had to pick one first because I'm kind of bad at writing multiple things at once. And so I picked epic fantasy, and then I kept writing and science started to leak in, and I was like, well, I'm just gonna let it happen. So that's kind of, it kind of happened almost organically. Some people really like it, so my plan is just to kind of lean more into it as I go on. So
that's awesome. Yes, it's your world. You can do whatever you want. So we've got a couple questions on social, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what we are working on for 2023. Jim, when you publish your book, this is more of a technical. When you publish your book that's mostly epic fantasy, do you publish it on Amazon under epic fantasy, or do you publish it under science fiction?
Absolutely fantasy. It not only does it lean way more fantasy than science fiction, I would say that a fantasy reader is probably more likely to accept, science fiction elements into their fantasy than it would be if you said, this is a science fiction book, and then it feels mostly fantasy. That would feel kind of more of a betrayal to me. So I go with epic fantasy. So.
And there's not, for those who are watching, if you're wanting to get into writing, when it's time for you to publish your book, you get to pick these categories when you upload, and they're restricted to what's there. And I don't know that there's a science fantasy category yet. So like Jim said, you sort of have to pick the one, I guess, that most readers would be happy with if they stumble across it in that genre. The hiking reader asks, I'm curious if any of you remember what your first science fiction or fantasy reads were that may have gotten you interested into thinking you'd want to write this genre. SG, you want to start us on this one?
Sure. It was actually a movie, and it was Star Wars. And I think I told you the story that it was largely forbidden to be watched outside of the cinema when it premiered. And when it came to Hungary, I was only 1 year old, so I missed that premiere. And my dad decided that that's not a great thing. He wants to show these movies to his children, so he smuggled them in and used his own voice to dub it. And then we had a Sunday movie night, and that's what started me on the sci-fi fantasy, watching these Hollywood movies that he translated to Hungarian, not to sell them, but to show them to his children. And it started me on, broadened my horizon and got me very much in love with the sci-fi fantasy genre.
And here you are writing your own stories all these years later. Tyreen, what about you? Do you remember what your first one was?
So I had this book of fairy tales when I was a kid that I read over and over and over again. And then my parents took me to see Star Wars. So I think it might be somehow how those two things got mixed together for me, science fiction and fantasy. So yeah, I was pretty young. I was like 5 or 6 when I, really thought that fantasy fairy tale type things were really cool. And then again, Star Wars, it just, and then it was like, wow, you could write about the universe, or you could imagine about the universe instead of just, this world right now. Not that this world isn't great, but it's kind of cool to kind of open the horizons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jim, how about you? Do you remember your first science fiction or fantasy read?
The first one, it's hard to say what the first one was, but I mean, I might sound like a little bit of a broken record here, but clearly Star Wars, it's like one of the biggest things that made me. I mean, I used to read middle grade and young adult Star Wars books, and obviously seeing the films was really big. And I remember when the prequel series came out, and everyone was super excited, and I was just right in the right age to be super excited for it after seeing the older ones and it being like this. Mythical holy grail of, awesomeness that was blended together. So I mean, Star Wars and just reading different fantasy and science fiction in childhood, and then it just kind of converged. So.
And how about you, Danielle? Your first science fiction or fantasy read that got you to write?
I'll deviate from the pattern here because it was not Star Wars. I used to love the middle grade books for the Artemis Fowl series. And those were a really cool blend of, Artemis Fowl's scientific genius, the boy genius who got sucked into the fantasy world with fairies and magic. And the combination of both of them was just so cool that he didn't understand the fantasy elements and the fairies didn't understand his technological things, but they worked together to solve whatever problem came their way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think my first one reading, because of course I don't write this genre, but reading was Star Wars, but not the movies. It was actually the books by Timothy Zahn were some of my first reads. Now I did watch Star Wars growing up. Star Wars was around as long as I can remember, but the first reads that made me go, this is a world I want to read, were the Timothy Zahn Star Wars books.
Yeah.
So thank you, George Lucas. So speaking of reading and writing, let's talk a little bit about what is coming up in 2023. Editing, drafting, publishing. Jim, why don't you start us off? What do you have in the works for 2023?
Classified. No, just kidding.
Top secret. Insert X amount of money to access.
So I'm not really an island. I work with other authors to do other cool stuff. So my year is tied with their years. So I have some projects that I have to complete dev editing for and help a couple other authors with their projects to get them going. But for me, primarily, is I really want to, and I'm about halfway done. I'm a slower writer, so I can kind of take my time, and I don't rush to the finish line to my detriment. So I have a novella that I'm working on because I want something that I can give away for free. So I'm writing another novella to give away for free, so people can just try me out without reading 700 pages. I just figured, that might be nice for them to not have to go through all that just to decide that they'd rather read something else. So I'll give them something shorter. That will be a good introduction to the world. So look forward to that. It will be free to read, in ebook form. That's my main goal right now is that. So.
And that's a labor of love when you're an epic fantasy writer. The short stuff is the hardest in the world for me to write. And coming back and pulling in, you're like, oh, I thought I was trimming to get it to 100,000 words. Coming up with a novella is tough. So good luck. You got this.
Thank you.
Danielle, what about you? What is coming in 2023?
My goal right now is a March release for the third book of my trilogy. I have a couple chapters left to write. I'm hoping I can knock that out this month, start the whole editing, formatting process, because I go do it myself. And then hopefully, the trilogy will be wrapped up. After that, I do have another project, not in science fiction or fantasy. I'm actually going to step back a bit more into a bit broader fiction, but I kind of have a dark superhero story that's been turning through my head for a while that I'm excited to start once this series wraps up.
Nice. And we were talking on the panel before this one about how for some reason that very last book in the series is so hard to write. And I wonder if it's because we just don't want to let go of that world, or the what's next is more daunting, or what. But
I've felt that for sure. It's oh my gosh, this is finally going to be over. The story I've been working on for years is wrapped up. Say goodbye to the characters. And that's hard. It's very hard to just say that that's the end for everything you've been working on.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Tyrone? What's coming up in 2023 for you?
Well, I have a book coming out. This is actually a proof copy. On January 3rd, it's a book of 25 short stories it's a mix of fantasy and science fiction, and some that I would definitely say would be sci-fi, science fantasy. So anyway, it's coming in a couple of days. So it's short, but unlike those of you who write epics really easily, I may think of big ideas, but I have a tendency to write little short bits at a time and then kind of build. So I like to write short stories as well as novels. And I'll be finishing up book 3 of my science fiction novella series, and I've had a really hard time with it. So I completely understand having a hard time with the third book. Yeah. And then I have a Kindle novella series I'm working on. I don't work on one project for more than a week at a time, because I keep a lot of notes, especially when I switch over. But I've found over the years that if I just try to push through a 70,000 word draft, I'll get really stuck at about 40,000 words, and I'll just sit there and stare at my computer for a couple. So when I get to that point where I'm starting to stare at my computer, it's time to switch to something else and then switch back again until I finish. So yeah, different process. But yeah, this is coming in a couple of days. I'm excited. So yeah.
Yay! Congratulations on your release. I think you're one of the earliest releases that I've had on any of the panels so far. It's some for mid-January like me, some for end of January, some in March, but right here at the 3rd.
Yeah.
Resolve to read Tyrone's book.
Okay.
SG, what kind of projects are you working on in 2023? Because you are super busy too.
I'm very excited about 2023, Katherine, because I hope it will bring not just the 4th installment in the Les Lumanian saga, but a lot more in-person events like book festivals, a couple of book festivals I'm very excited about, and also a couple of Comic Cons, including the Los Angeles Comic Con in December, which we hope to return again. So very excited about this year, and I can't wait to meet all the readers. And please go to sgblaze.com to see more of the events. And I also have a monthly newsletter where fans and readers can follow all these events and all the new contents.
Sorry, my mic keeps me muted. I'm like, let me talk. I love all the conventions. We've talked about several conventions over the last 2 days that are coming. And this is so exciting for indie authors because there have always been glass doors that you don't see. There's pros and cons to going traditional, and there's pros and cons to publishing yourself. And being able to show up at events as an indie author is huge. So whether it's Storybound Book Fest or the fantasy convention or the Comic Cons, definitely follow these authors so you can keep up with where everybody is. Speaking of following them, all of their links are in the description box if you're watching on YouTube. So you can hop over there to grab copies of, Tyrene's new book or the Danielle series before the last one comes out, or what Jim's working on. A lot of great plans for 2023. Jim and Danielle, y'all both mentioned editing, and got a writer question for you. How much do you think you can self-edit your book before you need to pay a professional? And what are your options if you don't have the money to pay for a professional editor?
For me, I don't know. Like, I don't know how much I can self-edit myself. It's an interesting question. I have a process, but I don't know if it'll translate directly to everyone else. What I do is I kind of just, part of my slower process is that I cannot turn off my internal editor. I will just craft the sentence and then craft the next sentence and then craft the rest of the paragraph and then go back and make sure the paragraph sounds right and then move on. That is not, I would say it's probably not a good way to approach it. If I had to pick, don't do that. I just have a hard time not doing that. But the good news is that if you are that kind of person, you get faster at it as you keep doing it. So it's not as much of a problem. I do a couple of things to trick my brain into seeing my manuscript in different ways. When I first write it, I write it in Arial, in 11-point font, no single spacing, and no indents.
Wow.
I write it that way. And then when I go back and read it, I put the indents in, I change the font, I double space it, and then it looks a little different to me. And it's easier to catch errors. So I do that usually on my second pass when I go in and fix okay, I know I need to put something here, or I need to add dialogue here. This thing changed, so I need to change. So all that stuff that I've kept notes for, I reread it there, I catch things. And then, at some point when I'm done revising and before I send it to an editor, I will do a pass where I let my computer read it to me. And that helps catch errors that you don't see sometimes. So it doesn't work 100% of the time, but sometimes you'll catch errors like, oh, there's a drop word here, or this word's misspelled, I didn't even recognize that. That kind of things. So that's at that point, after I do that, it's kind of like, well, there's not much more I can do. It's time for an editor to see it. So, and if you don't have the money for an editor, that is a hard situation. You can possibly set up trades if you have an editor that, if you're good at editing and they're good at editing, then that's a good trade. Or if you're good at developmental editing, but they're good at copy editing, that's kind of what I do. I dev edit for someone who does my copy editing. And it's complete switch off. Yeah, so.
Like graphics, covers, stuff like that. I've definitely traded services before because I'm also a developmental editor for a living. So it's like, hey, I'll do your developmental edit, like you said, and trade. But there's also software now. And I spent last year working for Autocrit, but I was a lifetime member before I went to work for them. So, and this video is not sponsored by them. They have a free membership that will catch a lot of the gross errors, and they have theirs set to where you can compare your book by genre. So I would go in and I would put in my book and I would say, I want to be compared to either this specific author, like I write dark fantasy, so I could compare my book to Anne Rice with them, or I could set it to just fantasy in general. And then it would say, hey, you use these pronouns, you use this X% more than the average author in your genre. It was very helpful. And so when I got the opportunity and was able to afford a lifetime membership, I went ahead and snatched it up. But they have a free one you can start out with if you want more than just your eyes. And I know there's other programs that do something similar. And Danielle, you do most of your own editing and formatting yourself. So what would you have to add to this?
I mean, I think the first thing to note is that no book is going to be error-free. I've read, traditionally published, super famous authors who've missed a word on a page or something like that. And everyone loves to jump on it, but the reality is we all just read and your brain will fill in blanks, so nothing will be perfect. For myself, I've always been kind of a grammar nut. Like, I'll use full punctuation in texts, so I'm that kind of a person. But my process is kind of just write it, reread it 2 or 3 times in chunks, because if you try to do too much, you'll kind of just blank out and forget what you're reading. But then I also have a couple readers who, after I'm done with what I consider to be my last like attached draft, I'll send it to them. And these are people that I trust who, are meticulous in like how they read things. Does the sentence make sense? Is there punctuation, awkward wording, or even sometimes just story edits as well? Oh, you could expand on this part a bit more. And that inner circle of people that I trust to do that next edit for me help shape anything that I might have missed. And then everything can come together for that final draft.
Mm-hmm. Great advice.
I would also say that as far as affordability, if you're looking for an editor, a lot of editors adjust their pricing for how awful the manuscript condition is. If you deliver a manuscript that needs a lot of work, then the prices are probably going to be higher. So I would just recommend, using those tools and using as many passes as you can get to get it as good as, just so that editor has to only spend time getting you from 90 to 100% clean draft, which doesn't exactly exist. They'll probably miss stuff too. They miss my stuff too. It's a little frustrating, but it happens. I mean, everyone's human. So, but yeah, just, do as much as you can before you send it to an editor, and they'll say, oh, this is actually really clean. I don't even need to charge my full rate. Some might do that. So it's worth it putting in the work yourself.
Yeah,
that's a great point, Jim, that you mentioned, is to cut down the word count as much as possible. And you can do it with the developmental edit run. When you look at the structure, is this scene necessary? Don't throw everything out, put it in another, document, paste it into another document, save it for later, because us writers, it's hard to delete words. So I tend to save everything I cut. In fact, you can always add your deleted scenes to a newsletter and have a little special, showing for your readers. But break up run-on sentences, take out the filler words, get rid of the pesky adjectives that sneak in. Try to do more show than tell. These are all the developmental and line editing tools that everyone can do before getting into the nitty-gritty editing. And it's just sometimes as easy as using the search tool on your Word document.
And Tyree, we got a question for you about Right in the Harbor. Will you be doing something like Right in the Harbor again in 2023?
I hope so. Yeah, I plan to. I get to teach a continuing education class at the community college that put on Right in the Harbor. So I'm hoping to be able to do Right in the Harbor again too. I really appreciate it when I get to be able to teach at conferences or at events. And so, yeah, it's pretty cool. And I hope
That's
so.
Awesome. So in short, you'll have to follow Tyreen if you want to see if other events like that come up. And really, the advice that you get from fellow authors is invaluable. We had someone on yesterday that said you don't have to take a writing course to write. You just have to write. But learning from other people can also streamline and help you skip mistakes that the rest of us have learned the hard way along the way. But yeah, this has been some great insight and wisdom on today's panel, just from all of you. If there was one special thing that you would like readers to know, to watch for in 2023, what would that be, Tyreen?
I mean, of my work, I'm gonna say, this is 2 days, so so my short story book, yes, and I'm just hoping to complete some things, like the Rayatana series. I'm hoping to complete the 3rd novel, and I'm actually not even sure it's the last. That's where the debate has been with finishing it, and so the 3rd book in that, and this, and my Kindle Vella series, which I've been having a lot of fun with. So yeah, that's why I've been doing that.
Awesome. SG, out of all the things you've got this year, if you had to pick one special thing, what would it be?
Well, it's very hard to pick, Katherine, but I think I'm going to go with the fourth book release, which is going to be early December. It's a little bit later this year, but I'm at least consistent. And I hope the readers will have a lot of fun with this book. This is different from the first three, so can't wait to see what the readers think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. How about you, Jim? One special thing.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to narrow it down, but since I don't have a release date for my next book yet, I will say you should check out my YouTube channel. I don't have a lot of videos yet. I will be doing more videos this year. I have plans, I have scripts written. I just need to actually do them. And of course, if you follow me there, I'll eventually let you know when the novella comes out. So that's like 2 in 1. So yeah, follow me on YouTube. I talk a lot about books, but I try to go a little bit deeper. My goal is to be the literature teacher you wanted in high school. The one that talked about fantasy books instead of, the books that they actually wanted you to read that weren't as fun. Yeah, so check it out.
Yes, and I pulled that one up on the screen so that people watching on YouTube, you can just put in that at Jim Wilborn in your search bar and pull it up. But the other links for everybody else are still in the description box. Those are a little longer, and since you can't click this screen, you'll want to scroll down to the description to click them. Danielle, if you have one thing, what would it be?
Publishing my third book. Very excited for this to come together. I left book 2 on a bit of a cliffhanger, some emotional moments, and now the fate of the galaxy is hanging in the balance, and I'm hoping everyone gets excited when this comes out to see everything comes together.
It's so surreal for me because when you first reached out to me, it was like 2020, I want to say, or 2021, like late. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's been a while, and here we are. It's 2 or 3 years later, and I'm gonna have to say goodbye to the series.
I know. Well, I started writing it in 2016, so this is like even longer, and I'm like, wow, it's finally wrapping up.
Wow. Well, thank you all for sharing your books with us and a little bit about your writing and your inspiration with us. You're such an inspiration to me, and I know to many other writers as well. Everybody, if you're watching, you can give all of these people a follow with their links, and we will be back in about half an hour with another panel. We've got 3 more left today, so subscribe to my channel if you would like a notification when we go live for the next panel and to meet more indie authors for 2023. Happy New Year, everybody!
Happy New Year!
Happy New Year!
Bye.